Welcome. This is Genocide. Today we're continuing with Lara Elborno, the Palestinian-American international lawyer and an activist. She's with us today. Hello, and thank you for speaking for Genocide.
Thank you for having me.
For a start, can you just tell us how do you navigate your legal practice alongside your advocacy for Palestinian rights?
It's true that the bulk of my work is in international arbitration, which is not directly focused on human rights, but I see myself as a human being and as a lawyer who has a responsibility to speak out against injustice. And it's really that which compels me to speak out in support of Palestinian rights, which have been unfulfilled for so long. Palestinian lives have been at risk and at stake for so long. And especially in this current moment, as they're undergoing a genocide, I believe that everyone has a role to speak up to stop this moral atrocity of our time.
And what personal and political experiences have most shifted your commitment to international justice and liberation?
Well, I think first and foremost, my own personal lived experience growing up as a stateless Palestinian refugee is probably the single most important factor that drives what I do, which is I became deeply empathetic to people undergoing injustice and deeply empathetic to humanity. And so that experience is probably central in terms of driving me. But also, I grew up in the post 9/11 era, watching the US invade Iraq on the basis of false premises and engage in mass killing and torture for years. And so much of the advocacy that I engaged in during my college years was focused on resisting the US invasion and occupation of Iraq. And, you know, that deeply troubled me. And it, again, really impacted me in terms of, you know, what I thought was possible in the world that we were living in. You know, you heard about atrocities happening in the past, but part of me was thinking, you know, this can't be happening today. And so I find myself saying the exact same thing today in 2025 with the Gaza genocide.
And how do you see your role in bridging legal analysis and grassroots mobilization, particularly on platforms like social media or in public speaking in general?
Yeah. I think law is not accessible for most people. And so I see my role as trying to explain it to you know, a non-technical audience and offer a critical analysis of it, also offering a Palestinian perspective on it. And I think it's really important to hear from Palestinian voices. We have so much to contribute to the conversation since what's at stake is our destiny. And oftentimes in discussions about Palestine, Palestinians are wholly excluded. And you see this a lot in the mainstream Western corporate media. Or if they do appear, they appear only to be interrogated and humiliated, not to be received as credible narrators of their own lived experiences. And so this is deeply troubling. So I think it's important to hear from Palestinians, and it's important to hear from Palestinians about what they've lived through, but also about their areas of expertise.
Yeah, you have spoken and written extensively about Gaza, and in legal terms, how would you describe the current situation? Is genocide an accurate and actionable framework?
Genocide is absolutely accurate, but it's also not complete. So we know that Israel is committing a genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. There's no debate about this anymore, 19 months into this atrocity. And Israel has even stopped trying to hide its intentions. If you look at the most recent statements coming out of Israeli leaders, Netanyahu has said that Israel intends on permanently controlling Gaza. Netanyahu has said that the so-called war will not end without the implementation of the Trump plan to forcibly displace all Palestinians from Gaza. And, you know, so I just take him, you know, for what he's saying. I think we need to just listen to what their intentions are. You look also at what Israel has done, the facts on the ground that it has created in the last 19 months. They've destroyed 70% of all infrastructure in Gaza, 92% of all the housing units. It's turned nearly 80% of Gaza today into a no-go zone, essentially cramping Palestinians into these small, non-contiguous enclaves within the Gaza Strip. And so it's very clear what the intention is going forward. But I think it's important for us to also understand that genocide is not a complete analysis. So we should see this genocide as the culmination of an essentially nearly century-long settler-colonial process of removal of Palestinians from their land and replacement with a Jewish settler population. And that's what's been going on. And it's precisely because the settler-colonial process has not been stopped prior to now that this genocide was able to be committed before the world, on a daily basis. So I think it's really important for us to understand the connection between genocide and the broader settler-colonial project at play.
And how do you address to those who argue that legal labels like apartheid or genocide are too politically charged to counterproductive?
I think this is a bizarre argument because it assumes that there's some sort of a duty not to use language that is politically charged. And I reject this premise. I would actually argue the opposite, that we have a duty to name the violent processes that are taking place. If the term genocide offends you, then the solution is not to commit a genocide. So I think avoiding naming also has the effect of delaying accountability. So it's really important for us to name what is taking place, because as soon as there's even a risk of genocide, that triggers the obligations of states and people worldwide to try to stop the genocide. And that's precisely why Israel has resisted the label for so long, because once that label is attached to its conduct, then everybody has an obligation to try to stop it and to do what's within their powers.
So referring to that, calling things the right name, and we have like a world on one side saying it's not genocide, and we cannot say it's genocide. But on the other side, we have a world that's not going against dehumanizing Palestinians. We have media all over the world going alongside with Israel, dehumanizing Palestinians, but nobody is going against that. But everybody's against saying it's genocide. How do you comment that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would like to make just a clarification. I don't think there's a world that's insisting that it's not genocide. I actually think that the majority of the world...
International community, kind of most of its part.
Yeah, I think the majority of the world actually supports Palestinians in their liberation struggle. I mean, that is very apparent in terms of the global solidarity movement that we have seen rise up for Palestine. And even just the states themselves, when they vote in the General Assembly, they are, most of the time, an overwhelming majority supportive of resolutions that come forward in support of Palestinian rights. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you've mentioned something which is extremely important, and that is the topic of the dehumanization of Palestinians. Palestinians are incredibly dehumanized, and this goes part and parcel in Israel's campaign of annihilation. If we were not dehumanized, then people would be less willing to accept the violence that they are seeing committed against us. But Israel dehumanizes us precisely in order to tell people, no, but it's okay they're being killed because they're not really human anyway. And even their children aren't human. How many times have we heard Israeli leaders come out time and again, even just a few days ago, saying that the children are targets, that the Palestinian children are not innocent,
and being killed,
and that they should be killed. Even the latest polls in Israel show that the majority of the population supports expelling all of the Palestinians. Almost half of the population supports killing all of the Palestinians. And so when you see that, you can see how deeply dehumanized Palestinians have been. And so I think it's really important for us to reject this entirely, reject this dehumanization. Israel wants the world to accept a policy of extermination and annihilation for the Palestinians. And it wants people to accept this as normal, as ordinary, as inevitable, as something that just has to be done. And so to those people who are willing to accept this, I would say to them, why is it that you expect us to accept something which you would never accept for yourself? You would never accept the colonial violence that Palestinians have been subject to. for yourself or for your own families. You would never accept being expelled from your homes and having them be taken over by, a foreign occupation. You would never accept daily bombardment. You would never accept being starved to death. So why is it okay for Palestinians? And I think we need to reject this dehumanization wherever we see it. Primarily, being in the West, you see it so often in the mainstream corporate media. As a Palestinian, I don't accept to go on those platforms because I will not accept to engage in a discussion with someone when my humanity is up for debate. There are just some things that are non-negotiable. If you want to speak to me, then we have to at least agree on the premise that you see me as a human being deserving of all the same rights that you expect for yourself.
And you've mentioned media, and how do you approach legal advocacy in the media landscape where Palestinian voices are often silenced or distorted? You have just kind of mentioned start of this answer.
Yeah, so I think it's important for Palestinian voices to be heard. I think it's important for us to work with independent media organizations, to start our own media organizations. I think it's important for us to do everything we can to get the evidence out there. And if you look at what Palestinian journalists on the ground have been doing in Gaza for 19 months, risking their life, they've become targets. Israel has systematically massacred Palestinian journalists. And yet they wake up every day and they go to work and they document the massacres and they upload them for the world to see. And they're doing incredibly important work. And it's, I believe, our role to amplify what they're putting out there in order to educate people about what's happening. But, as I said, in terms of mainstream corporate media, I think the best policy is a boycott policy. Now, there are people who accept to go on those platforms and they use those platforms for their own strategic purposes. And, I wouldn't tell anyone not to go on there, or not to try to use the platform to their benefit. But just my own personal decision has been that I think it's important to only engage with people who see me as a human being and see my child as the same as their child.
And what role do international lawyers have in challenging dominant narratives and inserting accurate legal framing into public debates about this?
I think international lawyers have a tremendous role to play in the narrative war. If you look at South Africa's genocide case, one of the main things that it did was that it created a space for citizens worldwide to be able to call Israel's conduct a genocide. Prior to the submission in October and November, there were genocide scholars which were coming out and already naming Israel's campaign as genocide. But there were people that were still reluctant to engage in that type of analysis because they were scared that they could not defend it. But once South Africa's case was filed, there was like an immediate shift you could sense towards naming Israel's campaign as a genocidal campaign. And I think that's one of the most important consequences of what they did. So in terms of contributing to the analysis, shaping the narrative for advocacy purposes, and giving people the language that they need to speak up.
And what does being part of the Palestinian diaspora mean for your work and justice and liberation?
I think it's a very unique role. I have deep empathy and understanding for what Palestinians are going through, while also having the opportunity to address an American audience, having grown up my whole life in the United States and having had an American education. And so I think for me, my personal goal is to get every American to question why is it that their tax dollars are being used to starve and kill families in Palestine. I think that's the single most important thing that those with a platform towards an American-speaking audience can be doing in this moment.
And how do you see your activism contributing to transitional solidarity movements? And what lessons can be drawn from other anti-colonial struggles?
We can learn so much from other anti-colonial struggles. One thing that's really interesting from the South African apartheid struggle is how the ANC and Nelson Mandela were painted as terrorists. Mandela himself spent 27 years in prison for resisting apartheid. But if you look at how he's remembered today, he's remembered as a hero. There are children's libraries named after Nelson Mandela. So I think we should understand that the historical record has a way of vindicating the oppressed. And, that reminds me of the new book on genocide called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. I think that's definitely where things are and where things will be in the future. But I think, by then, of course, it will be too late if people wait to speak up. But I think it's important for people to understand that the narratives that we hear today, the extremely, charged narratives about, Palestinians are terrorists and Palestinians, are, hiding their children behind bombs or whatever, these extremely racist and dehumanizing narratives are not the narratives that we will be hearing, in the future. And history will have corrected all of this. So it's important for us to be able to see clearly now. And act before it's too late.
What kind of alliances have you found most powerful or promising in the fight for Palestinian rights?
I think people need to understand that the struggle for a free Palestine is a global solidarity struggle. The majority of the world sees what is happening to Palestinians and supports Palestinians in their rights-based struggle. I travel a lot, and every time I travel and I say I'm Palestinian, I'm always received with so much positivity. People will say immediately, we love you, we love Palestine, free Palestine. That's just been my experience in the rest of the world. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that we're not alone. And I also really appreciate the work of my anti-Zionist Jewish comrades who have and continue to work very tirelessly to dismantle the apartheid regime and to end Israel's genocidal campaign, all the while being, a minority essentially within their religious community.
Yes. And what advice would you offer to young Palestinian women entering legal spaces historically dominated by Western institution and culture?
I think the first piece of advice I would offer is to find allies in your workplace. It's really important not to be alone and to always be in solidarity with those around you. It's important to work 100 times harder than everyone around you, but still know that you are a tremendous asset and that you have everything you need to succeed.
And as a participant in the Gaza Tribunal, how do you see its contribution to exposing the legal dimensions of genocide and settler-colonial violence?
The tribunal seeks to build a historical archive of testimonies and written submissions on a number of topics in relation to the Gaza genocide, but also the context in which it arose. And I think one of the most important analyses that's going to come out of this tribunal is the analysis on Zionism as a settler-colonial ideology and the Gaza genocide as the latest phase of this settler-colonial process of elimination and replacement. Because we're a people's tribunal, we're not restricted by the formal black-letter law. And so it's really important for us to be driven by this decolonial analysis in all the work that we're doing.
And why do you believe people's tribunals still matter, even in the age of formal legal bodies like ICC or ICJ?
I think that everything matters. We need everything all the time. We need the formal institutions like the ICC and the ICJ, but alone they are not sufficient. They're not going to free us. If they were capable of doing that, they would have already done that. But their work, nevertheless, has been historic in shaping the narrative war and providing civil society with the tools to push their governments, to push corporations to end their complicity. And so I think we need everything all the time. We need to support their work, but we also need to support accountability initiatives outside of the formal institutions.
And how might the Gaza Tribunal shape the historical and legal narrative for Palestine, particularly for future generations?
I think it's important for future generations to know that there were people who mobilized and tried to stop the genocide. I think it's important for future generations to have as much access to as much evidence as possible. And part of the tribunal's work is going to be in collecting testimonies and submissions with containing evidence about exactly what happened during the Gaza genocide. So I think that preservation of evidence role is really important also in a world where the news moves so fast but headlines get buried and you can easily forget something that happened even a week ago. I believe in never again for all people. So my hope is that the work of this tribunal can contribute to a future where no people ever again have to experience living a genocide.
What would you say to skeptics who would question and are questioning the legitimacy or utility of conscience-based legal forums like the Gaza Tribunal?
I would remind that we need everything all the time. If you're a writer, write about Palestine. If you're an artist, make art about Palestine. The lawyers contribute through legal analysis and oral advocacy. Some people's role is to resist on the ground, and if you're outside of Palestine, your role is to find ways to resist on the outside. And so I see the tribunal's work as essentially contributing to a much broader global solidarity movement and not being like the single answer, or being disconnected from that.
Yeah, what fuels your work? In the face of deep grief, injustice, and media hostility, like what continues to fuel your work?
First and foremost, the Palestinian people. They are my number one inspiration in everything that I do. They are a deeply noble people, a beautiful people with a historic culture and connection to their land. And they're so inspirational. My Palestinian ancestors, my Palestinian family, they're really my number one motivation. And of course, my Palestinian daughter. I want her to live in a world where this type of violence is just not even possible, much less something that has now become a daily fixture of life that Israel and its supporters are expecting us to just accept as an ordinary happening. So I think it's important for us in the face of all this to reject this and to say, no, this is not normal. Nothing about this is normal. We reject this violence. We reject this annihilation campaign. And we're going to do everything we can to stop this. And unfortunately, we have not been successful so far, but that doesn't mean that we give up. We don't have an option to give up. There are still, I don't know how many Palestinians left in Gaza because the death toll is so unclear. The official death toll is somewhere around 60,000, but we've already seen other estimates that show that it could be well into the hundreds of thousands. But whatever it may be, there's still, people in Palestine. There's still people in Gaza who want to live. And we don't have an option to say that we're too tired or too depressed or too hopeless to keep going.
And what does justice look like to you, not just in courtroom, but in the lives of Palestinians, and not just in Gaza, but everywhere?
I think justice is just about undoing the harm that has been done in the most simplest terms. For Palestinians that are undergoing a settler-colonial process of elimination, justice is about being able to live on your land without the threat of that elimination anymore and engage in a very mundane life. Take your kids to school, go to work, go on vacation, and not have to worry about the safety of your children, not have to worry that they're going to be starved to death, not have to worry that they're going to be burned alive in the night in a school where you're sheltering because you've been expelled from your home, right? The struggle is really a struggle about living, a life with simple freedoms. But Palestinians have been deprived those freedoms for so long. And so I really see the work that we're doing right now is just trying to recenter the discussion. Well, what are we talking about here? We're talking about people just being able to live. live free on their land, enjoy the same freedoms that you enjoy. It's not about more than that. And it's not an unusual demand. There's nothing crazy about this. It is a simple, logical, human struggle for freedom.
Lara, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lara Elborno was our guest, Palestinian-American lawyer and an activist. Stay with us and stay tuned for the next interview with the witness eye.